Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so nice to have you here today. My name is Philippa Rappaport. I'm the head of education and engagement at the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology, and I'm joined today by Phoebe Sherman, who's the manager of student and teacher programs at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. And then also behind the scenes, we have Rhett Ransom, who's an IT specialist, and he's providing IT support today. So in our session today, we'll explore how postage stamps can be used in the classroom to encourage civic awareness and engagement. We'll examine how stamps can spark curiosity and deepen understanding of civics, American history, national identity, and commemoration by using thinking routines that focus on subject matter and artistic design. And you'll see how these approaches come to life with students, and you'll leave our session today with classroom-ready resources and ideas for incorporating postage stamps into your teaching practice. So this will be a very rich session today with applications to a variety of classrooms. So as we get started, just a few logistics. I see some of you are starting to introduce yourselves in the chat. Hi, Liam and Kirby and Eleanor. It's great to see you here. Um, if you need live captions, you can click on the Show Captions button. We'd love for this session to be interactive, so please use the chat liberally. We'd love to hear what you're thinking and if you have any questions. We'll try to answer in real time, but if we miss anything, we'll definitely get to it at the end. You can also use the Q&A if you want. One thing is when you're putting something in the chat, you can tag it to either hosts and panelists or to everyone. So we would love it if you would tag it to everyone, unless you super don't want people to see it except for us. Okay. What else? So today's session is the eighth one in part of a 10-part series, and this is really intended to explore teaching techniques and strategies and resources that help tell the story of America's 250. So the series celebrates well-known people and events and accomplishments of our nation, and we also want to provide opportunity to talk about lesser told histories. So our intention is that you leave each session with a collection of techniques and ideas that eventually help students think critically and recognize their own value and appreciate others' perspectives and ultimately gain confidence to be engaged learners. So you can find everything on this educator programs page that you see here, and I'll put that link in the chat. We also have a complimentary Learning Lab collection for each of the sessions. So this is the one from today, and I'll also put that link in the chat as well. So before I turn it over to Phoebe, just a reminder that today's session is being recorded. And for those of you who have been with us before, you know that we like to start out with a question. And so today's question is, think of a postage stamp you've seen before, either US stamp or international, and something that you felt connected to or especially liked. And then tell us in the chat, what was it and why did it stand out to you? And I will turn it over to Phoebe.
All right, it's my turn now. Thank you, Philippa, for that introduction and sharing that context for our session today. So, hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you today. As Philippa shared, my name is Phoebe Sherman, and I'm the Student and Teacher Programs Manager at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. And as I'm speaking now, I'd really love if you could continue sharing your thoughts and ideas in response to the question in the chat. So thinking of a stamp you've seen before that you liked and why? Why did you like it? I saw as folks were introducing themselves, we had a couple people say that they are stamp collectors or have worked with stamps before, which is really exciting to see. And if you're new to stamps, then I hope that by the time we finish today, maybe you'll find a new appreciation for them. So as Philippa shared, The program tonight is intentionally connected to the 250th anniversary in the United States, but this isn't the only semi-sesquicentennial, I hope I pronounced that correct, that we've been celebrating at the National Postal Museum. You may or may not know, but the United States Postal Service actually also turned 250 last July, in July of 2025. The Postal Service in the United States was actually established almost an exact year before the Declaration of Independence. Um, though postage stamps themselves were not first used in this country until much later in 1847. But as we'll explore together tonight, US postage stamps have functioned as official government issued commemorations for quite some time. Postage stamps have been used to mark significant moments in US history, provide an opportunity to reflect on what the nation chooses to honor and how that history and national identity is then circulated through everyday life. I like thinking that the US 250th, it's not just an anniversary, it's also a moment of reflection. And stamps then can provide an opportunity to engage young people in that reflection while elevating civic awareness and increased opportunities for civic engagement. But these are a lot of really big ideas. And, I think just like stamps themselves, it's good to start small, and identifying where we may already have individual connections seems like a good place to be, which is why I chose this introduction question. And loving the responses that are coming through in the chat. Laura shared that she really loves the Keith Haring stamps. I also love those stamps. I went out and bought them when they were first released. Um, the the Ziggy stamps that came out, the Graf Zeppelin stamps came up in the chat. So there's a lot of ones that people recognize and remember for whatever reason that is. Whether you're a philatelist, which is the official word for a stamp collector, or you're just sending a letter, or you see a stamp with your favorite childhood book character on it. There are so many different pathways that we can form personal connections to stamps, and those moments of connection are one of my very favorite things about my job. So let's go ahead and start diving deeper. Philippa, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thank you. So as we start to get into some of these big ideas connecting to the 250th civic engagement stamps, I want to take a moment to just first ground ourselves in the why behind the objects that we're going to look at today, and thinking about why stamps, because that might be something you might not have considered incorporating into your teaching practice before. So I like to think of stamps as opportunities to be both primary and secondary sources. Thinking about them as primary sources because they are created at a very specific moment in time, that moment then reflects the values, priorities, historical context of the government and the society that produced them. In that way, they provide firsthand evidence of how a country chooses to represent itself in that moment. And as well as, of course, as secondary sources, they serve as jumping off points to dive into the subjects that they feature. When we consider stamps as part of the historical record in this way, we begin to see how stamps may or may not reflect our civic values as we understand them. It allows us to have lines of inquiry into what are our civic values, what is our national identity, how do we as individuals relate to that, how and what do we choose to commemorate in this way. So I hope that we'll see that stamps are accessible, they're visual, can drive curiosity. And so we'll keep going in that train of thought. And I'm seeing a couple more responses come through. The Liberty Bell stamps, Vinny says the Liberty Bell stamps were the first to come to mind. And that's like a very classic one. I feel like a lot of folks are like, oh, yeah, I've gotten a letter with the Liberty Bell stamp on it before. So you might be wondering, like, where did that Liberty Bell stamp come from? And so I think as we talk about stamps, it's really important to understand how stamps are selected. So anybody can submit a proposal for a stamp. All you have to do is submit it to the US Postal Service. There is no age limit on who can and cannot submit an idea for a stamp in this country. So once you send your proposal for a stamp, it's reviewed then by a group of people known as the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee, or CSAC for short. And the CSAC, they're currently a group of 11 people, and they are experts in all different topics in art, in math, in science. And they're appointed by the Postmaster General, and they meet quarterly to review proposals. They then make recommendations from the proposals that they receive from the American public to the Postmaster General, and then ultimately the president for approval to become a stamp. And I'm seeing even more responses in the chat. The Stregonona stamp, says Kirby. Jan has remembered the American craft stamp. As you're thinking about the stamps that you connect to, you might think like, what hasn't been on a stamp? And in many ways, you can put almost an infinite amount of subjects on a stamp, but you can't put everything. So Philippa, would you mind going to the next slide? So thinking about what can and cannot be on a stamp. So CSAC reviews all of those proposals, and then they make their recommendations based on like what they think would make a good subject, but those subjects have to fit a very specific criteria. So I'm paraphrasing the criteria here. But this is the way that we talk about it with youth here at the National Postal Museum. We like to use the acronym AIPP, and that stands for American Important, Positive, and Popular. So all US stamps must be American or American related subjects. They must be important subjects, things that honor the extraordinary and enduring contributions of Americans to our society, our history, culture, the environment. They have to be positive subjects. The US Postal Service makes it very clear that negative occurrences and disasters would not be commemorated on a US postage stamp. And they also have to be popular subjects. The Postal Service aims to have a balance of topics that would be appealing to a diverse American audience. And as you've been sharing in the chat, right, habitats of animals and wildflowers, there are quite a few diverse stamp subjects there. Some other things that I think folks often find interesting, living subjects are not considered for stamps. But all US presidents do receive a stamp. They are memorialized by stamps after their death. You may or may not remember this past October, there was a stamp released in honor of former President Jimmy Carter. So I want to just dive on in then to looking at some stamps together. You know, we've grounded ourselves a little bit in like the why we're looking at stamps, a little bit more about how stamp subjects are chosen, but let's dive into some of those subjects themselves. And so we're going to do that through two different thinking routines today. Now, typically, when working with young people, I would generally recommend sticking to just one thinking routine at the start to guide your inquiry, but I can't be stopped. I had to pick two. So you know, with the understanding that every classroom is unique, and I had a desire to really cast a wide berth of how stamps can be used for different thought processes of civic inquiry, excuse me, and engage in across different contents. So I wanted to pick two different thinking routines that we found work really well with stamps. And both of these thinking routines come from Project Zero. And I'm curious, you can let me know in the chat if you are familiar with Project Zero or if you have ever used a Project Zero thinking routine before. I see a lot. Trisha says, yes, great resources. They are great resources. If you are less familiar with Project Zero, I encourage you to do a little research for yourself. Project Zero is an educational research center through the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and they have a lot of different initiatives. One of them is a series of thinking routines, and these are two of those thinking routines. You might be familiar with the thinking routine See, Think, Wonder. That's often a lot of people's like first entry point into Project Zero thinking routines. But really, what these routines are designed to do is to make thinking visual. They work particularly well with museum objects because they support close looking. And so, the two thinking routines that we are going to look at today or use to guide our inquiry into these stamps. The first is Connect, Extend, Challenge. And we're going to use this thinking routine to help us link different stamps to different civic and historical contexts. And then the second thinking routine that we will be using is color, symbol, image. And this thinking routine will really help us analyze how different design elements and stamps work together to convey deeper meaning. Is anybody familiar with these two thinking routines? Let me know if you've ever used Connect, Extend, Challenge or color, symbol, image in the chat. Um, but we're going to keep going with our inquiry into stamps. And so, Philippa, would you mind going to the next slide for me? All right. So I see Helena shared that they've used Connect Extend Challenge before. So maybe the folks who have, you can kind of be our experts with this warm up. So this is the first stamp that we're going to look at together, and I would like to invite you to continue using that chat again to share your connections to this stamp. So are the ideas, the information, how is the image of this stamp connected to what you already know? What does it make you think of that you might already be familiar with? And you can share that in the chat. For me, I live in Washington, D.C. now, where the National Postal Museum is, but I grew up on Long Island, just outside of New York City. So this image of the Statue of Liberty is something that I have a lot of childhood memories of going to field trips growing up. That's, something that I think of. I have that childhood connection to it, but then, of course, like much more deep other connections. Like some of the things that are coming through in the chat. So Atara shared thinking of liberty, freedom, sunsets. Nicole is sharing that it reminds me of sunrise or sunset on the Hudson River. I love that you're picking up the colors on this stamp. Laura also is thinking about trips to Ellis Island. Kimberly, sunsets and the view from the Staten Island ferry. I love the connections that you're making to like wider New York City. I think that that's really special. Similar connections to I had, but if you felt like you had different connections, of course that's okay too. I love this stamp because it is such a colorful, excuse me, and unique way to depict something that has become synonymous with civic symbols and national identity, and that's the Statue of Liberty. So Philippa, would you mind just going to the next slide? So there are many ways that we can make connections to the stamp, as you have, been sharing in the chat, thinking about the view, the sunset, where the Statue of Liberty is located. Some of us might even have family connections to the Statue of Liberty through our own immigration stories. I think that moving then from connections to extensions, I'd like to invite you then to share in the chat what are some other topics that you could connect to this stamp? Where might you push your students' thinking to extend? Where, if you let your mind kind of wander from topic to topic, what are some extensions that you could then connect it to? I think when I was thinking about extensions, of course, I had to go back to stamps. But it made me start thinking about how it's an opportunity to extend our knowledge on things like considering the United States' relationship with France and how the Statue of Liberty came to be in New York. I think it provides other opportunities to work, especially with young people, to extend their knowledge about migration patterns, the history of immigration in the United States. As you're sharing in the chat, Kaylee shared about how it makes them think about how it's such a privilege to experience our freedom. Laura shares similarly to what I was thinking, immigration, connections to France, excuse me, to sculpture. You could even extend it, as Jane is saying, to talk about engineering. how tall it is. I saw somebody put in the chat, things like that, right? We can push our thinking into all of these other topics. And then we come to that last part of inquiry, which is challenge. And I think some of these, the challenges, the puzzles, the questions that we might have about this stamp, those themes are already starting to come up in the chat. Things about democracy and freedom and immigration. The Statue of Liberty is a civic symbol. It's an icon of national identity that is historically and symbolically intertwined with immigration in this country. I think it invites us to explore the challenge of how we've lived up to the promise of hope and freedom that the statue represents for so many people, and invites us as well to question where we may have fallen short in the last 250 years and where we want to move forward within these ideals and within these values. So before we move to the next stamp, I want to just take a temperature check. How did that thinking routine go for you? You can let me know, maybe like 1 out of 5, 5 being like, this is great, give me more, 1 being like, maybe I need a little bit more practice. All right, Helena's giving me a 5. Thank you for boosting my confidence. Kimberly's a 5, Avril a 3. All right, we're gonna see if we can get that up a little bit. So Philippa, would you mind going to the next slide? So for here, we're going to continue with this thinking routine, but with a very different stamp. Um, so I'm going to invite you to engage in the same line of questioning. We're going to start with that connect question first. So take a moment, let your eyes wander around this stamp. What do you notice? And what connections, if any, can you make to this stamp? And you can share those as well in the chat. I'll share that personally, this is one of my very favorite stamps. I think it is beautifully designed, and as we'll explore, there's a lot of layers of symbolism and opportunities for like more exploration with this stamp. So keep those answers coming in the chat. I see Kimberly has shared that's something that they can connect is things irony about internment camps. Jan is noticing that the design looks almost like a fingerprint, things like that. So and keep those coming. So I selected this stamp for a few reasons, other than the fact that I just happen to personally love this stamp. One reason is because I think it's so powerful. It's a powerful object to build a conversation around commemoration and civic identity. And Philippa, would you mind just moving to the next slide? So, if we continue thinking about this idea of how and why we honor events, people, and places, I want to share a little bit about the subject in this stamp if you are less familiar with it. So, this stamp honors the about 33,000 Japanese American soldiers in World War II. Its focus is on recognition, memory, and often the overlooked contributions, and the importance then of commemoration of those contributions through collective recognition. So, the soldiers that are honored in this stamp, many of the 33,000 Japanese Americans who served in the US Army during World War II were known as Nisi, and that means second generation Japanese Americans. And for a time, the Nisi were denied the opportunity to fight a fight in the army during World War II, despite being American citizens. As some folks made some connections in the chat, um, many of them were forcibly removed to Japanese incarceration camps due to fears related to loyalty and xenophobia. However, eventually they were allowed to fight. They were formed into the 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It's really important that I want to get that correct. And they became an incredibly decorated unit. In fact, they were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 2011. Their motto was Go for Broke, which you see here on the stamp, and it's also the official name of this stamp. Other Nisi who were not in that unit served as interpreters, as translators, As interrogators, they served in the engineer construction battalions, and in fact, more than 100 Nisi women joined the Women's Army Corps. So, knowing that context, I want to invite you then to make some connections. How does this maybe extend your thinking? And I'm seeing some folks in the chat sharing things that are almost kind of jumping ahead to that. I love that we're starting to make connections and this thinking starts to feel almost natural to us. Kirby shared that it makes you ask questions about the role of Japanese Americans in World War II. Many people are familiar with learning about Japanese internment camps, but maybe it might extend our thinking of like other stories that have happened. And I'm paraphrasing what you shared a little bit there. Laura is sharing that Arkansas had two internment camps, so there feels like there's a connection to local history as well in this stamp. I think as what you've all identified, this stamp builds on our prior understanding of citizenship and identity in the United States. It pushes me to extend my thinking about civil liberties during wartime. And like the questions that you've raised in the chat, it brings up questions and invites us to consider what patriotism is. What does it mean? What does patriotism mean to these soldiers? What might it mean to us as individuals? What does it mean for the country? Now, before we move on to the next stamp, I want to take a minute just to actually point out some of the design choices and deeper symbolism that's embedded in this stamp. So the stamp is designed by the art director for the stamp is Antonio Alcala, and the stamp itself is inspired by photographs of the unit. Like the image that you see here, which is of the color guard, and it was taken in France in 1944. I'm curious if anybody noticed the patriotic colors used in the stamp. Did that stand out to anybody? The stamp itself is pretty minimalistic, but we do see that red, white, and blue motif. My next question, if anyone noticed this, is did anyone notice the vertical styling of the words, of the typography in this stamp? Because that is actually very intentional. It's unique that it's arranged vertically. The choice references the traditional style of Japanese writing. So at the surface, we might notice, oh, it's a soldier, going a little bit deeper to extend our thinking, learning more deeply about the story of the Nisi Japanese American soldiers and their incredible contributions to our history. And then it allows us even to go even deeper into that symbolism in those design choices. And that's what we're going to sort of transition to is now thinking about how does the art and design of stamps specifically help engage us in this, in our civic identity, in our civic actions. So Philippa, would you mind going to the next slide? Okay. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit. I want to keep our line of thinking, and I'm loving the continued connections that are coming through in the chat, and connections to other stories that you might want to elevate on stamps. Helena shared that she has these stamps. So okay, let's talk about these stamps then. Let's use this other thinking routine. So this thinking routine is the color symbol image thinking routine. And I'd like to invite you to share, taking a look at these stamps here. What is a color that you feel best represents these stamps? What's a symbol that they make you think of? And is there an image that comes to mind? And it's okay if what you think of you're not actually seeing in the stamps, like if it's a different color or something. This is about you and your connections and your reflections. So feel free to share a color, a symbol, and an image about what these stamps make you think of. Alex is sharing orange is a color that they're thinking of. Avril is saying orange too. Atara is noticing that there might be some deeper symbolism with an RBG flag equals a symbol. Vinny is noticing a red and the blue. Laura is sharing the yellow feels like it's high energy. Philippa, would you mind going to the next slide? Let's go a little bit deeper. into the stamp series. So these stamps are pretty recent. They were released in 2020, and they highlight four elements of hip hop: DJing, graffiti art, emceeing, and b-boy. And though the first day of issue ceremony, so the day that these stamps were released, that ceremony was held virtually due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they were unveiled in collaboration with the Universal Hip Hop Museum in the Bronx in New York, which I believe is actually set to open their doors just later this year. So the elements of hip hop are outlets of creative and social expression that developed as a cultural movement in the Bronx in New York and emerging in the mid 1970s, and of course remains popular today. But what we want to focus on is really how the design elements contribute to the meaning of the stamp. And I'm seeing a lot of people continually sharing like new things that they're noticing about the design. Marna is sharing that it makes them think of glitch art. Kimberly shared that it's more than just the color, it's the blur, that layered image that's standing out to them. So thinking about the design elements, the four stamps, they all feature photographs by Cade Martin, and each photograph depicts an individual who is actually involved in these elements of hip hop. So the DJ, MC, and graffiti artist, the talent featured in those stamps, all are from Washington, D.C., and the talent in the B-boy stamp is actually from Philadelphia. A lot of people notice the high contrast in these images, that layered image with that bold black, green, red, the yellow, a little bit of orange comes through. That really creates a visual energy and a sense of immediacy, kind of like the rhythm and the beat of hip hop music. The really bold digital images, they're actually intended to appear in motion, which I think some folks started to pick up in the chat. And that motion itself echoes the rhythm, the dance, the sound of hip hop music. What I find really interesting is, in contrast to the movement of the image, the typography and the layout of the stamp is quite clear, right? It's really bold letters, bold words that are fairly easy to read. And when I think about that design choice, for me, it reinforces hip hop as a structured and an intentional cultural system. These design choices elevate from everyday postage from a platform of just something that would be on a letter to cultural storytelling. And so why does that matter for civic engagement? I think it matters that the models for these stamps are working hip hop professionals from local communities. It emphasizes authenticity. The partnership with the Universal Hip Hop Museum centers on education, preservation, and access to this art form, to this cultural movement. It also encourages reflection, I believe, on whose stories are represented in national symbols and why. Putting all these elements of hip hop on stamps, it raises social awareness and creates a public dialogue about this subject within our communities with anybody anywhere in the world that might lay eye on these stamps. It positions the subject as part of our national identity and American story, and not just popular culture. And I think that really matters, especially with young people when they might see themselves reflected in a stamp. Feeling validated, that they too are part of the extraordinary American story. So let's go to, I think, the last stamp that we're going to look at during our time together. But we're going to still keep practicing this color, symbol, image thinking routine. So I'm going to invite you, as we've been doing, to share a color that you feel represents this stamp, a symbol that you feel represents or captures the essence of this image, and then an image, an additional image itself. What does it make you think of? Avril shared that yellow is a color that jumped out to them. Curious what colors jump out to other people or what symbols. Nicole shared the color orange. The symbol of the book jumps out to them, the image of the sun. Holly is sharing gold sunshine. Vinny shares the stars and the sun jumps out to them. Keep them coming in the chat. Philippa, would you mind just moving to the next slide so we can dive a little bit deeper into this stamp? Okay. So, I'm curious, has anybody seen this stamp before? Is this a stamp that anyone is familiar with? This stamp, it's not an old stamp, but it's a little bit older than the last ones that we've looked at. So this stamp was issued on September 14th, 2007, and it is known as the Mendez versus Westminster stamp, and it commemorates the landmark civil rights case, Mendez versus Westminster. So if you're not as familiar with that Supreme Court case, it was brought by civic-minded Hispanic parents in 1945, where they successfully challenged and then ended school segregation of Mexican American children in California. Sylvia Mendez, who we see in the photograph first as a child and then later as an adult receiving the Presidential Medal of Honor, was the child at the heart of this case. So thinking about how this stamp elevates civic engagement as a window to the past. The issue of this stamp marked the 60th anniversary of the Mendez versus Westminster case, and it helped pave the way for Brown versus Board of Education. But the design choices in this stamp are deeply symbolic and allow us to go a little bit deeper into the civics and the symbolism behind just the topic on the surface. So this stamp was designed by Ethel Kessler, and the artwork is by the artist Rafael Lopez. And Rafael Lopez's art makes very specific design choices to communicate that deeper meaning, like we've been discussing. He intentionally blends the visual style of Mexican muralists with a symbolic sense of hope and forward movement. You might have noticed the faces in this stamp are they're turning towards the sun, and that's intentional. The imagery emphasizes the sense of looking forward to the light. And that light itself, the yellow, the orange, the sun juxtaposed next to the stars, that those are all design choices and deeper meanings that a lot of you picked up on in the chat, which is great, right? That's what these thinking routines are designed to do. This stamp reinforces themes of justice, of progress, of equity. And I think that this stamp is really valuable when we think about civic engagement because it elevates a community-driven legal victory into a national civic symbol. And I love that it takes an everyday object like a postage stamp, and shows us how it can carry a really powerful story about representation, about advocacy, of democratic action, which all connects back to our shared civic values and our shared civic actions. So we've looked at 4 different stamps now, and I don't want us to completely abandon the stamps that we've looked at, but I want to now take this to a larger context of postage stamps in the United States, casting a very wide net again. So as we've done by exploring their subjects and artistic design as pathways of inquiry, we can use stamps then to deepen our civic learning and better understanding of who we are and who we want to be as Americans. This quote is from the United States Postal Service, and I think it captures that idea well. I like to think of stamps as tiny diplomats or even like a miniature national gallery, right? Capturing 250 years of our extraordinary American story, as we've been discussing. But that is also a really big responsibility. And while the public can suggest topics, it's the government that ultimately decides what and who appears on stamps. And then that, therefore, shapes how our shared values and history are represented. And sometimes we've gotten that really wonderfully right. And at other times, it has created windows where we might reflect on how we could have been better. So Philippa, would you mind going to the next slide for me? Okay, thank you. So maybe that pause there might be helpful because I'm going to ask you to kind of to take a breath and take a look at this data. And I'd like to invite you in the chat to share your initial reactions to it. What does it make you think of? What questions do you have? I won't give you a thinking routine, but I'm curious. How does this make you feel? Are you surprised by this data? Are you not surprised? Does it feel like it's representative of your own personal experience with what postage stamps that you've seen? As I mentioned in the last slide, we haven't always succeeded in creating a truly holistic, like national gallery, to use that metaphor. And I will say that in looking at this data, it is really important to consider that the all other categories section includes things like animals, places, holidays. So that is, really inclusive of all other categories, not just individual stories. But of course, that doesn't change that many of the diverse, extraordinary American stories from our history remain underrepresented in stamps. I'm curious in the chat if you want to put any guesses when the first woman appeared on a stamp. What year do you think that was? What year do you think the first woman appeared on the stamp? I'll let you know, but I'm curious. So you can put your chat guesses in the chat. So the first woman on a U.S. stamp was Martha Washington in 1902. So Trisha, you guessed 1915. That was pretty close. Yeah, Liam said early 20th century. Any guesses who or what year the first African American appeared on a stamp? So the first African American to appear on a stamp was Booker T. Washington in 1940. So I see some guesses thinking the 70s. It was a little bit earlier than that. It was a little bit earlier than that. But actually, it was in the 1970s that the first African American woman appeared on a stamp, and that was Harriet Tubman. And the first Harriet Tubman stamp was released in 1978 as part of actually, it was the first stamp in the Black Heritage Stamp Series, which continues to be the longest running stamp series that the U.S. Postal Service has. The first Latina woman on a U.S. stamp was Frida Kahlo in 2001. So, as we've been noticing, although there has been progress, the data makes it clear that there is still work to do. And I think that work is a really wonderful place for youth to get engaged and to exercise, right, their civic action in this way. Um, so I do want to share if you are interested in engaging young people in this work. I mentioned at the beginning that anybody in the United States can propose an idea for a stamp to the US Postal Service. And I want to kind of wrap up by sharing a few resources on how you can help support your students in doing that, in actually taking that civic action to share their ideas of what they believe should be on postage stamps. So I have a couple of resources that I would like to share with you. So this one is a series of lessons that can be used as individual lessons or as a curriculum guide. It's called Design It. This resource works best for middle school through high school students. So if you work with slightly older kids, this might be a really great resource for you. And this collection of lessons guides you and your students in similar to the work that we did today together, recognizing national American imagery that's on stamps and walks them through the process of doing some close looking, some deep thinking, some idea development, and then to move forward into the creation of their own stamp ideas and stamp proposals. So this resource, and as Philippa shared, it is included it's a linked in the Learning Lab that we shared at the start of this session. Um, though you can scan on the QR code there if you want to check it out right now. It is best for middle and high school students. Our next resource, Philippa, if you want to move on for the next one, is okay. So Recognizing that not everybody teaches middle and high school students, but these ideas, this civic action, can be done by kids at any grade, any age. As I shared earlier, there's no age requirement for submitting a stamp idea. So if you want to engage your students who might be in elementary school or early in middle school in these ideas, this resource is it's a lesson plan. It's called Submit a Stamp Idea. And like we've been talking to it, will walk your students through learning about the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee, how stamp topics are selected, what the different criteria are, and then give students an opportunity to craft their own proposal. So design it and submit a stamp idea. Both get at really similar content, but they are differentiated for different age groups. The last series of resources that I want to share are for younger learners. And so this resource is best for early learners and elementary students, but truly for all of these resources, I think that there are like nuggets of wisdom in all of them that can get used cross content, cross age groups. So this is a stamp stories series. It's actually more than one resource. So this is a collection of videos that dive deeper into the topics of stamps. And I see the question in the chat, Atara. I'll let you, I'll get to that in just a second. So stamp stories selects a stamp topic. The example that I put on the screen here is of Eugenie Clark, and then it is a story for younger learners, a story time, and then pairs with an expert on that content to dive a little bit deeper. And this resource is really great for early learners and elementary students. And Atara asked in the chat, what happens once your stamp is designed? Are you notified? Is there a ceremony or something? I fear that my answer may disappoint you, Atara. So, actually, you are not officially notified if your idea is selected. You kind of just have to keep an eye out on what stamps are released to see what happens. You might have a really good idea. Somebody else might have a similar idea. They could combine them into a new topic. Maybe like multiple people might suggest the same topic that could get chosen. So really keep an eye out on what stamps are released, but I will share that stamp subjects are selected multiple years in advance before they're released. So if you're thinking about proposing a stamp that is time specific, like for example, the Mendez versus Westminster stamp was tied to an anniversary of the case, you might want to backwards plan a little bit and know that between subject selection to final art approval to printing, it can take upwards of 2 or more years. The design process itself takes at least 2 years normally. Helena shared, can U.S. territories submit ideas? As far as I'm aware, the answer is yes to that. But the best thing to do would be to double check with the U.S. Postal Service website. CSAC has their own website. And on that website, they share like the criteria in more detail, exactly how to submit an idea. And that website and how to do that is also embedded within all of the resources that I've shared. So if you are interested in exploring Design It or the Submit a Stamp idea, all of those resources are included in that. Feel free to keep putting some questions in the chat, but I want to be mindful of our time and I want to end on an intentional note. So I know I've thrown a lot of thinking routines at you today. I'm going to do one more. Like I said at the beginning, I can't be stopped. This routine is one of my favorites for finishing some reflections. And so it's called a waterfall reflection. And the way that this routine works is that we are all going to take 2 minutes, and it might feel like it's an uncomfortable 2 minutes of silence, but it's just 2 minutes. I'll try to respect the quiet time myself. But in those 2 minutes, I would love if you could write a response to this question in the chat box. So in the chat box, you can answer the question, if you could design a stamp to tell an extraordinary American story from the last 250 years, what story would you tell? And what message would it share about who we are as a nation? So I'm going to invite you to type your answers into that chat box, but not press send because we are all going to press send together at the end of those 2 minutes and we'll get a waterfall of responses. So Philippa has just started the timer. So try not to press send yet, but think about what stamp, what subject would you suggest, and what story does it tell about us as a nation? So we're going to take, you have about a minute and 33 seconds left. You have a minute left. There are so many stories yet to be told. I hope this isn't too challenging for you, but you can remember it doesn't have to be just a person. It could be an event, something connected to the environment. We'll take the next 40 seconds and then we'll all press send together. All right, you can press enter. Oh, I love all these responses coming through. Now it's the challenging part of scrolling up and seeing them all. Um, Nicole shared that I might be mispronouncing this, the Q Creek Mine Rescue, which is a topic that I'm unfamiliar with. So that's something for me to go and dive deeper in. Helena shares the African American military contributions. Um, Kimberly shared that they would love to see a stamp series about amusement parks. There was a carnival series that came out fairly recently, but there are so many amusement parks, like you've noted in your response of like highlighting some of those that are important in America's history. Abril shared Anna Smith, who is someone who was strong during the American Revolution. Liam shared thinking about reflecting on like how current events perhaps could become future stamps or might be reflected on stamps now. Trisha shared women's suffrage, the collective bravery shown by women over many years of fighting for the vote. Vinny shared a Frederick Douglass stamp, a stamp encompassing immigration at the turn of the century. You noted, Vinny, that there is a Frederick Douglass stamp, and I think there's two, but oftentimes they have like repeat subjects in those ways. And if we think about like the design elements connecting to symbolism, there's always more that we could tell about Frederick Douglass's story on a stamp. Jane shared images of national parks. Jan suggested Native peoples who were here, stamps maybe designed by the tribe or connected to specific locations. Atara shared that they would like to design a stamp that has multiple US iconic symbols, images, things like liberty, cherry blossom trees. Kirby shared it's really hard to pick. I agree. I kind of gave you an impossible question, but you all created some really beautiful responses. Holly shared that the Shelburne Museum in Vermont, I've been there before, has a wonderful collection of buildings and items that tell stories spanning 4 centuries. So maybe thinking about how stamps can connect to local history. I do know that they always release stamps in commemoration of like statehood anniversaries and things like that. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your ideas, for engaging in these big conversations with me today, for your participation and engagement. I have really enjoyed exploring this topic with all of you. And I hope that if anything, you come away with, maybe you might notice a stamp a second time, take a second look at that image the next time you see one. But thank you so much. And Philippa, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Phoebe. That was such an engaging exploration today. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen in just a sec, but we'd love to get your feedback about our program today. So here's the QR code, and I'll put that link in the chat. And then just a reminder, all of the content that Phoebe discussed today and the thinking routines and links to more resources from the Postal Museum, you can find all of that in the Learning Lab collection. So I just put that link in the chat. I'm just giving you a minute to take out your phones for the QR code if you want. If not, here's the link in the chat. And so we're open to Q&A. And let's see if anything's coming in the chat. Now that I've stopped sharing, I have to find the chat again. Ah, there it is.
Yeah, I
Okay,
see.
looks like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I see Marna asks, is there a way to search stamp topics by topic, theme, or idea? There are actually quite a few resources that you can use to do some research if you're looking for specific themes. At the National Postal Museum, we have on our website, we have quite a few curated digital collections of stamps within specific topics. So, for example, if you are doing a project in your classroom that is connected to African American or Black history in the United States, we have a collection of stamps on our website that you can search through that are celebrate specific individuals, events, contributions, things like that, as well as collections that are more broadly on things like airmail or transportation, things like that. So I encourage you to reach out to the National Postal Museum. Our education email is npmeducation@si.edu, but also search our website. Thank you, Rhett, for putting that link in the chat box for everyone. The United States Postal Service also has quite a few free resources for you if you are interested in researching stamp topics or learning a little bit more about the art of stamps, things like that. I would definitely encourage you to start with USPS or with the National Postal Museum.
All
Any
right. So I think, oh, here, what's the website? Charisha is asking again.
Oh yeah, so the website is postalmuseum.si.edu, and I'm sure Red, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just dropping that in the chat again. It's sometimes it scrolls up so fast with everyone's wonderful comments. And then the other place that you could look at is the U.S. Postal Service's website. They have quite a few resources on stamps. Those would be two great places to start. And then, of course, you can always email us at the National Postal Museum. Our education email is npmeducation@si.edu.
NPM education@si.edu. Okay, I just put
Thanks,
that
Philippa. Yep,
in the
thank you.
chat.
I'll have to remember
Oh,
to add that to my slide next time.
all right. Well, I think those are the questions that have come in. So, I'd like to thank Phoebe for her really beautiful presentation today and to all of you for joining us for this session. We hope to see you again. We'll have another program in the third Wednesday of May. We'll be focusing on STEAM resources, so that's putting the art in STEM. Um, and so we look forward to seeing you at another session soon, and thank you all for being here. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone.